think we could just visit, probably no bigger group than what we have here right now. But I've worked for the Park Service, like she said, a long time, 40-some years. And if I have learned anything, it's really the story of the people. That's the interesting part in what we're going to talk about today. The title, Hotter Than Hell and 100 Yards From It, actually was said by one of the commanding officers out at the fort. That was his opinion of Fort Larned. It was hot. He didn't like the wool uniforms. He wrote the War Department, tried to get permission to change the uniforms, and they said, no. You are an officer in the United States Army, and you will wear the prescribed regulation uniform of an officer in the United States Army. No doubt about it. So anyway, it's all really about the people. Fort Larned is a typical military post on the Santa Fe Trail. The Army, of course, had several. And give you a real, just quick little rundown on the history of the fort, and then we're going to go into more of the people. It was established because of the mail station that the post office department had built on the Pawnee Fort. They actually had a couple of their teamsters, not teamsters, stage drivers, get killed in fighting. And so they requested military protection at the camp on Pawnee Fort, at the mail station camp. So the Army brought out a squad from Fort Riley. And from that company, Lieutenant Bell, who first arrived there in October 1859, it just kind of grew and grew. The need never went away. They ended up thinking, well, they'll all get pulled back over the winter. They had to build dugouts and adobe structures there, use tents. And then it gets into the Civil War years. They decide to move the fort from that location just a tiny little bit to the west where it is now because of that big oxbow going around. At the time, they thought that gave a fairly natural protection, and on the south side, they tried digging breastworks, which didn't really work. But then they rebuilt the fort of adobe in that location. They made adobe barracks, they made adobe officers' quarters, shops, buildings. And then right towards the end of the Civil War, they start rebuilding Fort Larned. It's going to be a permanent fortification. We're going to need it forever, out of stone. The first stone Army building was the blockhouse. It started in 1864 as a result of a raid of Kiowa Indians on the fort. And then from that, they go into the major construction of building the sandstone buildings that we see there today. The Army soldiers really didn't do the work. It was done by civilian employees. They brought in about 200 to 300 civilians to make the buildings. By 1868, the stone buildings were all completed. By 1878, the buffalo are gone, the Indians are gone, the trail's dead, and the Army decided we don't need it anymore. So from permanent fortification, building all those beautiful stone buildings that will last forever, it gets closed in about 10 years. But they didn't know. Who would have known you could exterminate that many buffalo that quickly? You could alter the way of life with all those Plains Indians that quickly, that the railroads would go through that quickly. And so the Army did deactivate Fort Larned. But they didn't just close it. They left a squad of soldiers there, Army men to protect it. Based out of Fort Dodge, they would come up, and usually about 10, 15 people there most all the time during this whole period. They were worried about civilians coming in, taking windows out of buildings or timber. They wanted to be able to sell it. And it was sold at public auction finally in 1884. And at that time, the Army was officially done. During that holding period, they thought about turning it into an Indian training school, like Haskell has become. There's some indication in the records they were going to turn it also into an Army officers training facility, like Fort Leavenworth has become today. But then they finally decided, no, just sell it. One of the reasons they decided to just sell it, the temperance movement was hitting hard. The ladies in town were upset. The men in the county could still go out and buy alcohol at the old store there at the fort, which is still being maintained. And they didn't like that. They wanted Pawnee County to be a dry county. So that might have had something to do really with them deciding just to go ahead and sell it. But it was sold, became a ranching operation. It was privately owned then until the Park Service gets involved. LBJ signed it into law and became a National Historic Site in 1964. And it really gets staffed in 1966, then on up into starting restoration. First thing, we had archaeologists come in, historians studying the buildings, figuring out what's original, what was added during the farming era, and finally, what you see today is we're pretty much done with the restoration. We haven't done the commanding officer's house yet, and we want to get back on That's just kind of a real quick rundown on the history. Now, if we take a look at the people, we have to start really with the Plains Indians. Who was there? We had the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, Comanche, Plains Apache. They were all there, plus some other tribes floating through. Everybody says, well, why is it called Pawnee County, Pawnee Rock, if you don't mention Pawnee Indians? These other Indians come, the Pawnee Indians were there early on. When the early people were coming into the French, the trappers, the mountain men, they started naming things because they did meet Pawnee Indians. But when the other Indians come in, the Plains tribes, the Cheyenne, Lakota really were late coming in, but they do come in. They forced the other Indians out. So by the time of Fort Larned, the Pawnee Indians are actually up around Nebraska. They're no longer in that area. But those names have already been given, and they were kept. So there really were no Pawnee. The Army, of course, and the Indians didn't necessarily get along, but my agency, the Department of Interior, who I work for, gets involved now. They decide, well, we're going to have to do something, so they have an Indian agency for the Bureau of Indian Affairs established at the fort. The Army and the Indian agents don't get along, so the Indian agent had to actually rent buildings from the post sutler. His residence was in the sutlers, built for the sutlers' residence. They charged rent, a couple $100 every 6 months just to rent the buildings. But the agency with it there, we actually had 2 Indian agents brought in, Jesse Leavenworth and a man by the name of Winfield Winecoop, or he preferred to be called, his name was Wincoop, but he preferred to be called Winecoop because he liked to drink wine. But he was involved with the Sand Creek Massacre. He was an Army officer there. And he got so upset by what happened at Sand Creek, he resigned his military commission and decided to devote his life to work for the Indians. And that's when he gets this job as an Indian agency. Then he gets brought out to Fort Larned. You don't always hear these stories of the corrupt Indian agents. He did everything he could possible to help the Indians. Now, if you're a traveler going down the Santa Fe Trail, let's say you've got an oxen. Your oxen dies. It's your fault. You want to get reimbursed for this thing. All you have to do is fill out a claim, go to the Indian agent at Fort Larned and say, I saw an Indian shoot my oxen. I want reparation for that oxen. I want to get paid for it. Then they try to investigate, but there's no way to investigate anything. So that money then for your oxen comes out of the Indian allotment for their tribe. And how much of that really occurred, we don't know, but there certainly was some of that going on. But another interesting thing that happened with the Indians there at the time, the Army did a farming experiment. They brought in some Caddo Indians, they put them just to the east of the fort, and they gave them some plows and some equipment, and thought maybe they could help them become farmers. They started irrigating out of the Pawnee River, probably the first irrigation going on in this part of the state for sure. But it didn't work. The other Indians kept picking on them, not the military, but the other Indians. And so the Caddo then finally left, went back east again. So the little farming agriculture experiment didn't work. The agency was there until 1868. By then, most of the Plains tribes were forced out, and then they closed the agency. So we had all those Indians around. Now, if you're an Indian, just like us today, they're people, just like us. They were curious. We have an account from one of the Army officers who said, all the time I was at Larned, I never got used to the fact that an Indian might be looking in my window wondering how we were living. They would be allowed to kind of wander around a little bit. They would be curious about these buildings. And she said she'd look up and all of a sudden there's an Indian looking in the window at her. The room would go dark. They weren't trying to hurt anybody or kill anybody. Everybody thinks everything's all fighting, and there was a lot of fighting, don't get me wrong. But there was also a lot of peaceful attempts with the Indians trying to help them. We have accounts of some of the post surgeons actually being invited by Indians to come into their village. They would say, we know you doctor the soldiers, basically. Would you come out and help one of our people who's sick? Or it's one of our persons who's gotten shot. One time, a couple of Indian braves came in with an Indian who had been badly injured, got his leg injured. They wouldn't let him spend the night. The surgeon tried to get him to spend the night there in the hospital and treat him all night long, but they let him bandage him up and do what they could, and then they took One of the commanding officers during the Civil War is 1864. There's an Arapaho village south of the fort. And he wanted to go down and visit with the Arapaho. So he gets a squad of these soldiers to go with him. They go down to the Arapaho village. Now this is during the Civil War. So keep in mind the regular army has been pulled out to fight back east. And they're replaced with volunteers. So these are volunteers with him. They get tired of waiting on the commanding officer, who was also a volunteer, and let's just go back. So the soldiers went back to the fort and let him down at the village by himself to visit with the Indians. Nothing happened. The next morning, he came out of his commanding officer's house. Don't by any means think everything's fighting, but on the other hand, we had a lot of fighting. There was a mail detachment, it's not really mail, soldiers delivering a dispatch to Fort Zara, trying to get over there. They make it to about where the Larned airport is today, and they got attacked by some Indians. A couple of them were killed outright. They turned around, tried to make it, the rest of the detachment, about 5 guys, make it back to the fort. Another one was killed just a short distance from there, and finally a couple of them made it all the way back. The Army did mount a rescue party and go out. By the time we got out, they'd all been mutilated, legs had been hacked open, scalped, and just pretty well. But, we think it's horrible, but you got to keep in mind too, for the Indians, what they did was try to humiliate you in the next life. So when you go to the happy hunting ground, or wherever you're going, whatever they want to call it, you're going to appear as how you were left here. So often they would cut their penises off, stick it in their mouths, they'd cut their trigger fingers off so they couldn't fire a gun. Different ways. So when you get to the next world, you're going to try to shoot a gun, you can't shoot a gun, or you're humiliated one way or another. That was all very common. Another group now we need to take a real quick look at are the travelers on the Santa Fe Trail. Everybody thinks it's all Europeans going down the trail. It's going west. No, it's not. It is going both ways. Early on, there were not a lot of Hispanics, but at the time of the Mexican War and just shortly thereafter, a lot of experts feel that probably half of the freighting was Hispanic. Mexicans coming up too. It's not just Americans going down. Of course, the American factories is an outlet to get things down to Mexico. We're thinking of mom and pops and kids like you see on the Oregon Trail? No. The Santa Fe Trail was basically more like the semis you see on the highway. Trucks zipping back and forth. And there were caravans going up and down. And these teamsters were hired, just a paid employee, take the wagons from point A to point B, and oftentimes there would be a fairly important person with each group going down. Then they would buy things that the Mexicans have that you need here, maybe donkeys, bureaus, wool, different things, and come back with that. They also sold the wagons. They didn't normally come back with wagons. When they got down, the wagons were also valuable. These guys want to make as much money off of this trade as you could, so normally they would even sell the wagons when they got down to Mexico, down to Santa Fe. And the trail really doesn't end in Santa Fe, but the Santa Fe Trail does. And then you get other trails, like the California Trail, or other trails that go out from there into other parts of Mexico. Now, the average freighter was illiterate. They didn't leave a lot of diary accounts. We don't know a lot about them, unfortunately. Once in a long while, you'll find an account of some individual who could read and write that's going down and writes a really nice account of it. With the Hispanics, and they're coming up, there were these wealthy Spanish landowners, and they would go into one of their villages on their ground and say, you, and you, I want you to go down the trail back east, bring us these things and take these things and sell them. You don't have a choice about it. Now you're going down the trail. There's an account in the Fort Dodge records where the commanding officer of Fort Dodge got in trouble, but the Hispanic caravan going through gets ambushed by Indians. They were all killed, not all, almost all of them. And they wanted military protection, and the Army didn't give it. I'll explain that in a minute. But the interesting thing about this, these Spanish teamsters, people, were only armed with bows and arrows and lances. There wasn't a gun in the whole bunch. So another misnomer is that everybody has braces of guns when you go down. You have gobs of guns. commanding officer explained why he didn't give them an armed escort. It wasn't their habit to give armed escorts. They were expected to guard themselves. They don't have enough soldiers to provide armed escorts. They've rarely got enough soldiers to protect the military property and the structures of the fort. And every coach, male coach that goes through had to have an armed protection. And so you always had squads of soldiers. They had the option to go with the male coach, but they elected, they wanted to go faster and go on their own. So they didn't get armed protection. Another thing with the trail, if you're selling goods, and you're selling goods, if you get to Santa Fe before her, who's going to get the top dollar? You are. You get the most money. You know, so you try to outdo each other. In 1864, the military got so upset by all these people just willy-nilly going down the trail and wanting protection. They ordered the troops at Fort Larned to stop every caravan going through until there were 40 armed men in each group. Protect yourselves. That didn't really work. They'd skip around, you know this, you're going this way or that. No, yeah, some of them stop, not as many as you might think. But on this one Hispanic group, that did make it, no problems, one of the individuals got a person in later years to write down his story for him as he couldn't write. The interesting thing to me on this, just like we like to buy something nice, a lady maybe a new dress or a gentleman's suit or shoes or boots, when he got to Kansas City, he bought a suit. He wanted to be the only person in his village that had a store-bought suit that he could show off when he got back to the village. Now, what did the Hispanics wear on the trail? The same clothes they wore out in the field, just kind of a light cotton type thing. Their food basically was beans and rice. That was about it. A lot of the English freighters going down the trail, of course, just like us, I mean, they killed animals, they ate them, they brought food with them, they would stop, replenish their supplies. Like at Fort Larned, there was a store, a trader store, they called it a sutler store, you could buy things and go on down. So they had it totally different than what the Hispanic caravans did. To give you another idea, even of the English American firms going through, at Fort Zara, there's an account of a large caravan coming in, 60-some wagons. The front of the caravan's already arrived at Fort Zara. The back of the caravan is still miles out. It's not quite like wagon train where everybody's all bunched up together. You don't eat the dirt from the previous ones. The back of the caravan gets attacked by Kiowa Indians. The front of the caravan doesn't even know about it. But finally they get word, well, they're getting attacked back there, so the Army did send some soldiers out to protect the back and to chase the Indians off. They did an inventory of the weapons that this 60-some wagons from this American firm, how many guns do you think they had? That's just about right. Yeah, about like 5 revolvers, there was a couple of rifles, and several little shotguns. But the shotgun really was probably more common than anything else for hunting. And that was it. You know, you think out of 60 wagons, 5, 6 revolvers, a handful of rifles, and a dozen shotguns. That's about it. So Hollywood really, you know, that gives us all these concepts. It's really not true, these people. Okay, another class of people out of Fort Larned. Ladies. We have women there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, what are you doing?
Washing.
Washing. Well, you know, the Army allows one lady every 19.5 men to do the laundry.
She makes more than he does.
Yeah, she does. What do you think she makes?
Was it $19 a month?
$1 from each man, yes, at least. 19. But sometimes, let's say a soldier's lost a button. He wants a chevron sewn on his uniform, or he needs something patched. Or you get more money too for washing a blanket. This is just the dollars for the basic uniform. So there was supplemental ways. And on payday, soldiers get paid every 2 months, get paid in scrip. It's not in gold or coin. Guess who's at the front of the line? The laundress. She has this little account. I did laundry. I sewed a button on for him. I washed this blanket, deducted in a quarter. She gets her money before you get yours.
It's the way it should be.
Well, let's look at this situation a little bit.
Entrepreneurship.
You have a daughter. You want your daughter to become a laundress? She's 16.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, let's think about it a second. You could double your income. Your husband's a sergeant. He's making $32 a month or $34, depends on his time in service. All of a sudden, your family could be having a captain's pay. Yeah, you might want to think that did happen. Now, let's say a soldier's allowed a ration. So much meat, hardtack, or bread, and different things. A laundress is also entitled to a ration. Let's say one of the laundresses is missing and you're doing double laundry. Should you get double rations? You're going to get double pay, but how about double rations? No, that wasn't allowed. You only got one ration still. It's like a soldier got his daily ration. Now, there's a misnomer about laundresses that everybody thinks they were probably prostitutes and making money on the side. No. For a soldier to get married, he had to get permission of his captain. He had to be single. He could not be married. So, in order to get that permission, you're normally a sergeant or higher rank, first sergeant maybe. So, but if you were a single lady that came in to do the laundry, you've got on average 250 to 300 soldiers. You can be single very long? No. Most all these laundresses were married to NCOs, non-commissioned officers. And this prostitute thing is just a bunch of hooey. They did not. I mean, I don't have a single account of that ever happening before. The Army did have another class of ladies, 2.5 miles off the base. There was a house. And there was census records done in 1875. They listed ladies that worked it by profession. There were like 4 ladies. Prostitute, no doubt about it. Houses did accompany almost every military post in the West, even Fort Lauderdale. It was 2 miles off the base. It would not be allowed on the base. The reservation was 2 miles in each direction from the flagpole. Area, actually. But there's one really good account of the house. It was written by a U.S. Marshal, Deputy U.S. Marshal, G.D. Freeman. He came in looking for this desperado who had been stealing horses, and he had heard he was in the area of Fort Larned, and he then got wind that the guy was over at the house, which he was. But as he stopped at Fort Larned to get some soldiers to go with him to arrest this guy. And as they get closer, he jumps out of the window and manages to get away. But Freeman wrote an account. He said when he went in, there was a bar, and then off the bar was a hallway, and on each side of the hallway were the cribs where the ladies were. And that's really the only account we have of the building. We do know there was venereal disease. We've got accounts of the close surgeon treating him for that. We've got accounts of fights occurred at the bar. One of the soldiers that he had over there claimed that Mr. Boyd, who was running it, was cheating him, and he went back with the handgun and shot Mr. Boyd in the stomach. Luckily, Boyd survived. There's a lot of accounts of things that went on over there. But as far as the laundresses being the working ladies, don't confuse the two. There's still another class of ladies at the fort. They were considered excess baggage and had to make do with what the officer. But if an officer's married and he wants to bring his family out, that's allowed. But the family has to make do on what the officer's rank is. A lieutenant is allowed 1 room by his rank. A captain, 3 rooms. Commanding officer was usually the major, but he had the whole house to himself, the commanding officer's house. So if you have a family, a couple of kids, and your husband's a lieutenant, you've got 1 room. That's it. But that's still better than anybody else out there has. A lot of these guys would contract all their meals with the post sutler and eat it with the post sutler's restaurant. And some of them, of course, would get together if you were a single officer and maybe have one of the wives cook a meal for you. There's an account by one of the officers who took his daughter. She wrote it down, I think maybe 8 or 10 at the time, I forgot the exact age. But she talked about getting to go to the enlisted men's barracks with her father, and he would go over weekly to do an inspection of the barracks and do meals, and they would get invited to eat a meal with the men. And the cups, she said, were big handleless cups, and she could hardly get her hand around them. it's kind of an equal account that she would. Those are the ladies. Now, some ladies did not want to accompany their husbands. They stayed back east. One of the officers, L.W. Cook, the officers kept saying, he's a lieutenant. How in the world can a lieutenant make the amount of money this guy's making? To have marble top furniture, nice things in his quarters that no lieutenant can afford on his salary. They actually accused him of stealing. During the court martial, Lieutenant Cook simply said, it's not my money, it's my wife's. She was one of the wealthiest daughters of Indiana, wealthiest families in Indiana. And when she came out, Daddy didn't want his daughter to have to put up with, 10 pots and pans, no curtains on the windows. I mean, they really dolled up the house, had it very nice because of his wife's money. He married well. Let's look at the soldiers now, the actual enlisted men themselves. On average, height was 5'6". The salary, off the start, during the Civil War, off the start of Fort Larned, was $13 a month. It gets increased during the war to $21. Then in 1871, the Army says, well, we're paying the men too much. Let's take it back to 13. So then they dropped it back to 13. And desertions shot way up at that time. To give you an idea of how bad the desertion was, right, the United States 7th Cavalry had just been organized at Fort Riley. George Armstrong Custer is not in command, he's second in command. Davidson's in command of the 7th. But they start out at Riley. Between Fort Riley and Fort Larned, there's no boot camps, so they start training these men along the way, doing maneuvers as they're going along. 40 of those 7th Cavalrymen deserted between Riley and Larned, according to the military records. 40. Took your horse, took your gun, and bye, boom, out of here. The Army tried to catch them, you bet. Did they catch them? Almost never. The Army did not photograph enlisted men. They did not know about, fingerprints. That's not around. Change your name. Well, I'm not John Smith. I'm William Jones. What do you mean? I'm not a soldier. Grow a beard. If you have a beard, shave your beard. A lot of ways you can change your identity. A lot of them, that's how they got away. For enlisted men, the average age was about 22, 23. Technically, you had to be 21 to get in the regular Army of the West. Now, in volunteer groups during the Civil War, that's not true. You'll find all ages getting in the volunteer units. The regular Army, like I said, was pulled out during the war. They were replaced with volunteer units from Kansas. We had Colorado Cavalry brought in. We had Wisconsin Artillery brought in. Some from one unit from Illinois. But these guys would come in from all over. They were there for a very short period of time and then transferred on to another post. The regular Army, when they come back after the war, the soldiers are upset because these volunteers that were there during the war cut down all the shade trees. The shade's gone along the river. And in the first photograph we have is 1867. You can see stumps of trees. We think the prairie is treeless. It's not. The Arkansas River, certainly it was fairly treeless because it had a wide floodplain and it did flood all the time. But the Pawnee, the Walnut, and several of these tributaries had, according to the military maps, in places, heavy stands of trees, thick groves of trees. In fact, so many trees, the Army brought in a sawmill. It was a horse-powered sawmill. They would cut their firewood using the sawmill. They actually used the sawmill not to build wood to construct buildings, but for the boardwalks and some of the fences. They used some local wood for it. It just wasn't straight and good for building buildings. To make the buildings, they brought local wood in from Michigan. Enlisted men slept 2 men to a bed, 4 men to a bunk bed, in bunk bed units until from 1859 to 1871. Then the Army goes to a single bed per man. Why do you think they made the change? There's 2 major reasons that appear in the records.
Didn't have as many men.
Pardon?
Didn't have as many men.
No, that's not one of the reasons.
Too much fraternization.
Yes, that's one of the reasons. And the other reasons was the medical department complaining about health issues. That if a pandemic did occur, the cholera epidemic swept through in 1867, and killed a lot of the workers, and about 20 some people died in the fort. Took more toll on the workers than it did the soldiers, because we lost actually both. Far more of the soldiers we had 68 people die at Fort Larned fighting, or not fighting, that died at Fort Larned. Of those, about 20% died in fighting, and the rest were either one homicide that we know of, one soldier on guard duty, the storm comes up, it's wintertime, blizzard, he got disoriented, they found him the next day about 2 miles south of the fort, froze to death. He started apparently walking the wrong direction and probably thought, I'm going to hit a building pretty soon, and just kept going. You know, that sort of thing. So the enlisted men, their meals were pretty much the same thing day in and day out. You have a lot of beans, a lot of rice. How about buffalo? Fresh game? No. The Army was beef fed. They brought in beef cows. They were kept in big corrals over to the east. And the Army actually butchered the beef as the men needed food. There are accounts that the men actually would have preferred to have gone buffalo hunting and supplemented that beef from buffalo instead of whole beef. The cows, time they got them brought in, they were usually skinny, bony, not a lot of good meat on them. The commissary tried to keep 2 to 3 months supply of food on hand for the men. The average garrison being 250 to 300 men. That's a lot of food to feed that many men. They have a post bakery at the fort. The men do get 8 ounces of bread per day by the ration. Now, it's not like they cook a little 8-ounce loaf of bread and say, here's your bread. It's all cooked in the bakery and then sliced. You've got your slice of bread in the morning. Coffee, of course, there was always coffee in the barracks. The military allowed you 2 meals as a soldier. You have breakfast. What do you have for breakfast today, Linda?
What did I have? I had sandwich today.
Sandwich, all right. What do you have back there for breakfast today?
Sausage and eggs.
Sausage and eggs. Think you got that as a soldier?
Probably not.
None of you had potatoes and meat for breakfast and coffee? That's what they would have every breakfast. Noon. What are we going to have for noon meal? Potatoes and rice and meat. Meat was boiled forever. They boil it, boil it, boil it. Same thing, day in, day out. That's the military. Evening, there is no evening meal in the Army. You have those 2 meals. That's supposed to do you. But if you want, they would actually normally take the leftovers, throw them in a pot, the cooks would, and make a soup or a stew. And you can go on your own. There's no bugle calls. There's no mess call for supper or anything like that. But you can go back and get some soup or whatever. Or if you want to go to the post-sutler store, if you still got any money left after payday, and want to buy yourself a bottle of beer and a hunk of cheese or bread, do it. You're on your own from the retreat ceremony at 6 until tattoo, usually about 9 o'clock at night. You know, whatever you want to do for a meal. Or not eat. The Army's already given you 2 substantial meals. What do you need another one for? You know, that's like medical care for the soldiers, of course. We had post hospital there. The cholera epidemic was very bad. One of the soldiers in an account referred to it as chamber pot drips. That would, it's the body being depleted of all fluids really is happening. One of the surgeons, one of the Kansas units, got the brilliant idea of taking a buffalo, boiling the meat, and making a broth, and feeding some of the men in his unit that got it this broth. And it worked. None of his men died of cholera. Unfortunately, that surgeon contracted the disease. Nobody gave him any broth they made out of buffalo. He died there of cholera. He was the highest ranking officer who died. One of the officers that died at the fort was coming down the Santa Fe Trail and was rubbing his eyes and This guy has gotten a dust storm that got an infection in his eyes. And they put him in the hospital there at Larned. They didn't know about infections like we do, and he ended up dying. He was buried in the cemetery at Larned. Disease. If you're a soldier, you got a broken leg or something, you know, they would set it and do the best they can. They just didn't know about infections. They didn't wash their hands before they operated on you. It's not long they would. If you are at least a 4-company post, then the post was allowed a microscope. Anything less than a 4-company post by the hospital regulations, you don't even need a microscope for any reason. Now the enlisted men's water supply is just down a little ways from the post Sumter store. We mentioned he had a restaurant. He also had pig pens to get ham to feed in his restaurant. And he has an open bottom privy that dumps onto the riverbank. And you're getting your water about 400 feet on that. The commanding officer in some of his counts wrote, that please do away with your open bottom privy, put in a regular privy that can be sanitarily lined like all the rest of them. Because it's contaminating the enlisted men's water. They don't know about microscopic contamination. They're talking visual contamination. So that could explain some of the health problems and issues too. Just didn't know. If you're a soldier, you're allowed 1 blanket when you enlist. And if you're re-enlisted in 5 years, you can get a 2nd blanket. You have a bed sack full of prairie hay that you can sleep on your wooden bunk. And in the barracks, a very common problem is lice and vermin that get into that prairie hay. They would change the prairie hay in the bed sacks every month. You get fresh prairie hay, and it's allotted how much. People are people, and it's like now we've got in one of the accounts of one of the clerks over at the post office store. We haven't talked about clerks yet. This guy's responsibility was to feed the mules and all the horses and the animals and that stuff. He came up with the idea of taking this old prairie hay that's now been slept on for so long, and all the leaves are broken down on, just none of the stalks and stems, and swap that to the Army mules and animals and not dogs, animals, horses that they're using to pull the wagons and stuff, and take this good hay and sell it to travelers going down the trail. Well, they finally figured that one out. Horse fired the guy and fined him and everything else. But, there's all sorts of corruption even then going on. On the enlisted personnel, about at least half were foreign immigrants that came into the United States. Probably a little over 60% could read and write. The Army did try in 1871. It was ordered, but even prior to 1871, we could document some officers that were very progressive and wanted you to at least learn how to write your name. You look at the old muster rolls, it's amazing how many they have an X in. It literally did. His mark, and an officer would write down the name of the man. They wanted you to learn how to read and write. They would try. They did open up a post school at the fort. According to the order to do that, they put in a clock, and they provided paper and books and pencils, and the commanding officer said the school would be for officers' children and enlisted men's children during the day. And at night, in the evening, we're going to use it for officers' training, for signal flags and different things that these officers had to learn. So the school was used, and then on weekend, on Sundays, it was used as the post chapel. Enlisted men very rarely, though it did attend church service. Most accounts, it's basically the officers' wives or the Longs' families that go over to the church services. Church for the Catholic soldiers, and a very high percentage was Catholic, was done by a Jesuit. The Jesuit Society actually had a priest that would go to Fort Larned, Fort Dodge, Fort Wallace, Fort Hays, and make a circle. And he would try once a month to visit each post. Now you would think, this guy out there by himself, riding from post to post, Indians never bothered him. There's no account of any Jesuit ever being harassed, anything. So, but they did usually come in, they would hold the service for the Catholic soldiers usually once a month. Where they did it, whether it was in the barracks, out behind, I don't know. They did try to provide some sort of church service for the Catholics. The enlisted personnel, kind of rough life on average. You might serve your 5-year enlistment and never end up in combat. Probably never fire a rifle. Off the start, they were using Civil War muskets. They were single shots, of course. And then in 1867, enlisted personnel had the muskets taken away, and they were then armed with cartridge rifles. Model 1866 Springfield was the first one, and then towards the latter part of Fort Larned, it goes into the 4570 Springfields. This is kind of an interesting time period for weapon development. You get a lot of experimentation. They were wondering about different ways to carry metallic cartridges. There's one account of some men experimenting taking cap boxes and put them all the way around the belt and fill those with metallic cartridges for the rifle, instead of carrying all this weight in one place. The enlisted men also invented the temple belt during this time period. They would take a regular belt and have the saddler sew on canvas loops. You get these homemade thimble belts, which then the Army copied and said, that's a great idea, let's make thimble belts, not too many years later. A lot of them began with enlisted men. Why didn't they go to repeaters for the enlisted men? They actually experimented with those too. During the time of Fort Larned, the Ward Burton, if any of you guys have ever heard of the Ward Burton, it was the first bolt-action rifle by the Army. It was a single-shot bolt-action invented by 2 Army officers by the name of Ward and Burton. It came out in 1871. You pull the bolt up, pull it back, ejects, drop it around in, close the bolt, fire a second round. But it wasn't very substantial. The Spencer carbine and rifle. The 7th U.S. Cavalry was totally armed with Spencers, 7-shot repeater. They brought in a few Spencer rifles for the enlisted men to carry out in the field to see how those were going to hold up. But they just were too complicated. The average soldier couldn't, they get dirt in them, dust in them, jam. They had too many problems, so they got away with Spencer, and then finally went with the Erskine Allen design, single-shot rifles, 1 round. That's kind of a look at the enlisted men. Now let's talk about the officer corps for a little bit. In the less than 20 years Fort Larned was active, we had over 280 officers at Fort Larned. Some were there for a long period of time, others a very short period of time. A few were West Point graduates, most were not. We had one officer who won 2 Medals of Honor, Frank Baldwin, there for about a year and a half. He was actually he won during the Civil War, and another Medal of Honor he won, this idea he got during the Indian Wars, putting soldiers in wagons. Later on, he was actually even offered a 3rd Medal of Honor. He would have been the only person in the United States history to win 3 Medals of Honor. But he said, how about giving me an increased rank and more money? That's more valuable than another Medal of Honor. I've already got 2. And so that's what they did. It doesn't mean he didn't value the Medals of Honor, because he certainly did. When he passed away, the accounts tried to find him, see if we could get one for display, but they were actually very good. He ended up dying out of debt. Oh, I should have told you, we had one enlisted man too win the Medal of Honor. He was down in Fort Dodge and was doing courier duty between Larned and Dodge with dispatches. He gets assigned with another soldier to take dispatches back to Larned. He gets about Coon Creek Crossing, and they come upon a mail, guys cutting wood to take back, a wood detail. And they were attacked by Indians. And most people think it was probably Comanche. But anyway, they get the idea of taking the box off of a wagon, put it on top of a buffalo wallow, and get down to this buffalo wallow and fight, which they were able to do for a while. They realized that the Indians got way outnumbered, and they're really running out of ammunition. One guy on the mail detachment, Boyle, gets sent back to Fort Dodge to see if he can get through the Indian lines and try to get some help to them before they all die. According to this guy's account, it gets into hand-to-hand combat. basically have decided they're out of ammunition, just fight as much as they can before they die. It's dark, and they start seeing images of these white things coming up across the hill there behind them and towards them. And what it was, Boyle had gotten to Fort Dodge just in time. The 7th Cavalry realizes the urgency. The men didn't even take time to put on their uniforms. They came out in their nightshirts and their long white underwear. That's why you get these ghost-like images wearing white. They put on their gun belts and, of course, brought their carbines. And, of course, as soon as the Indians heard the bugle and saw these guys coming, they took off. That saved it. In the account, there was a pet prairie dog they found. We're going to take it back to Dodge with the detachment that it had. It got killed. The wagons that they had were just porcupine full of arrows. They don't know how many Indians got killed, and no soldier or with detail from the wood they actually got killed. But it really was close. Anyway, that's that account, another Medal of Honor. Those are really the only two we know of that were associated with the Medal of Honor. But the officers, a lot of them did bring their wives out with him. There's an account of one of the officers who hired one of the longest children, young boy, he said. They gave him like a quarter a month to keep his boots polished. Do that. Some of these officers were real sticklers. We had a commanding officer who ordered every detachment leaving Fort Larned had to come by the adjutant's office, had to be personally inspected by him to make sure they were in the prescribed regulation uniform and polished and looking good. And then they could go on out. You get about a mile out of the fort, you have to have dirty, junky clothes with you, change uniforms. If you're coming back in, you get a mile out of Fort Larned or wherever you're going, you put back on your good stuff and you go back in because he wants to inspect you when you get back too. So you have officers like that. But most of them were actually really very good officers. Most of them cared a lot about their men. Nicholas Nolan, captain of Company A of the 10th United States Cavalry, wrote that only one man out of the 98 men of these Buffalo soldiers could read and write, so he made him the first sergeant. His men served with great distinction while he was there. But now, being an officer over a black unit, even though Nicholas Nolan was hero of the Battle of Gettysburg and a famous cavalry officer, he sided with blacks. What's going to happen? He was ostracized by a lot of the other officers, the enlisted men, a lot of them. The term they use isn't really politically correct, but it's called Nolan's niggers. And cavalry stables mysteriously catch on fire in January 1869. The Army held a court of inquiry. How did the stables get burned down? They interviewed a few of the men, and they suddenly decided, gee, one of Nicholas Nolan's Buffalo soldiers burned down their own stables. Now, officers are financially responsible for all the acts of their men. In the stables burning down, there were 60-some horses in, 40-some of them died. All the saddles they had to keep packed, ready for a march at a minute's notice, get burned up. There was a lot of ammunition that gets destroyed. They inventoried the stables right down to the last foot of rope and 10 buckets and charged Nicholas Nolan at full cost, over $5,000. Came out of his pay. That's a lot of money back then for anybody. He has to start getting his salary, gets held up, he has to go to paying this back. And he begins writing to the War Department what's going on, what happened. And through his accounts, we know a lot of the discrimination that took place. Now, some officers ordered their men to even acknowledge the Buffalo soldiers. Look away when you're out mustering for pay or drilling on the parade. Don't even give them the honor of looking at them. The barracks for the Buffalo soldiers was never painted on the inside. The barracks for the infantry guys, all white, was painted and had plastered ceilings. Buffalo soldiers didn't even get their ceiling plastered. It was just canvas nailed up over the beams. Lots of little discrimination like that. Finally, what caused the stables to burn down, there were some black troops playing in the pool billiards room behind the supper store. You had billiard tables to go play pool. A couple of white soldiers walked in and said, "We're white, get out of here, niggers. We're going to play pool." Fist fight erupts, and these handful of black guys beat up a handful of white guys. For retaliation, the white guys then go over and molest the black laundress. White troops had white laundresses, black troops had black laundresses, and again, wives. Anyway, they molest her. What happens to the white troops? Absolutely nothing. The commanding officer at the time didn't really do anything to stop it. He ordered the entire company of 10th Cavalry to go out and guard a wood pile because he's afraid there's going to be a big race riot. And then mysteriously, just after that, the stables burned down. The 3rd U.S. Infantry is guarding, marching beat right in front of the stables. They don't even notice the building burning. The 19th U.S. Kansas Cavalry is stationed in tents out in the south. They see it. They sound an alarm. Some of the 19th Kansas guys come running out and open up the stables door, and they do save what was saved of the horses. And how in the world, during that kangaroo report, from what Nolan knew, and he put in his account, could they determine he was responsible for the stables? Finally, Sheridan, who was head of the War Department at the time, reimbursed Nolan his money, about 1875. He got paid back $5,000 he had put in. But he went for several years without any pay. Just amazing. Some of the officers, though, I mean, they were really good, served with distinction, did everything they could for enlisted men. Most of them were excellent officers, good officers. We have an account of one of the officers who wrote he never had any trouble with any of his men. This was 19th Infantry. Anyway, he selected the first sergeant by the meanest guy who could take care of every problem out behind the barracks. And the guy did. He never had any trouble. That's how disciplined he was. There was no uniform code of military justice at this time. Acts of enlisted men were, a group of officers would get together and they would rule on whatever they felt. They might say it's a white guy that's deserted. Catch him, bring him back. Yeah, let's stick him in the guardhouse on bread and water for a couple weeks, make him stay in there for a month, let him rejoin the company. We know of at least 7 black soldiers, Buffalo soldiers, that deserted. They were caught and brought in, ordered to be hot iron branded on the hip like they brand a cow. Had to go to prisons back east to serve the rest of their 5-year enlistment. Yeah. There was no uniform, whatever the whim of the officers is what happened. We also had civilian employees there at the quartermaster building. There were clerks. Buffalo Bill Cody was one of the clerks. He was actually hired by the Army to work in the quartermaster building for, he was there about a year and a half working over there. He went to one of the commanding officers and said, well, you know, when I'm out scouting for you, I need a gun. Could you loan me one of the military rifles? And the commanding officer loaned him a rifle so he could protect himself. He received pay as a scout of $200 a month. And that is equivalent to the commanding officer. So he was making good. Now, during the winter, when he couldn't be out scouting, they kept him on as a clerk, and his salary did go down to about $125. But still, that's captain's pay. He wasn't hurting. But when he left Fort Larned, the commanding officer wrote to the commanding officer at Fort Harker and said, sir, one William F. Cody, former employee of our post, I loaned him a rifle. He failed to return it. Could you please give my rifle back when he arrives over at Fort Harker? Has anybody ever been to the Cody Museum? You seen his Lucretia Borgia? His buffalo hunting rifle? It's a model 1866 Springfield 5070, identical to what was being used at the time that he disappeared with the rifle. The rifles at this time were not serial numbered. They started that the next year, about 1868. Is that a stolen Fort Larned rifle? We'll never know. But they never got their rifle back for it. So who knows? He might have decided just to keep the rifle. Cody, a few years later, moved forward in time in the mid-1880s, now 1886, he returns. And And he made the comment that he was shocked. He didn't think any of this prairie would ever sustain agriculture. Now, there were towns and farms. And he said if you'd offered him the ground around the fort, it was all worthless. Why would he have taken it? It had no value. Some of the officers, though, did see value. We know at least one officer that established a homestead south of the fort. How he maintained his company and able to go out and improve on the homestead, build a cabin. We don't know, but he did. That's his name. Then you had some officers. Larned was established as a community in 1872. It's laid out. Some of the officers actually speculated and bought some plots in town, just thinking that perhaps they're going to make some money off of it. That's kind of the officer corps, and then the clerks too. One officer is usually assigned as an acting assistant in addition to being in charge of his company. It might be a captain or a lieutenant, one of the men of the company. We have one of the officers who got a little bit too trusting. Some of the clerks in the quartermaster warehouse, he pre-signed a bunch of checks. And officers also have what's called a company fund. Enlisted men, a quarter every month goes into your company fund out of your pay. And I forgot to tell you too, another quarter goes to the old soldiers' home, so you have 50 cents automatically deducted out of that 13, even then. But he put all the money together, let the clerks take charge of stuff. He didn't get cashiered out or anything, but he certainly got chastised for not handling the money correctly and for trusting his clerks. You should sign checks only when they had to be signed and not pre-signed and all this stuff. One diary account, I think, really points out people like we are today. He wrote in his account, July 4th, 1868. We were all mustered out on the parade ground. During the night, somebody went out and hoisted a chair to the top of the flag. But he said normally, July 4th holiday, off today, drill and march all day long. Just like us, we're people. One of the officers wrote in his account, when the 7th Cavalry was there out under tent, out behind the stables, all summer, 67, part of 68, that at night, after retreat, you would hear some of the men playing juice harps, and their mind is singing. And so the officers' wives would go out on the front porches, enjoyed listening to the men singing. One night, some of the 7th Cavalry coachers actually came over and serenaded some of the officers' wives, and they made some cookies for them, some treats. On Thanksgiving, holidays, Christmas, and stuff like that, where they would normally, officers' wives would try to make something nice for the enlisted men, maybe cook some chicken or a turkey or something. The post hospital, too, by the way, did have a milk cow, and if you get sick, they did have milk as part of the ration, and they did have chickens. They kept their chicken coops and had eggs too. On holidays, or if you're sick in the hospital, they had a pretty good diet. They had milk and eggs there. I think we've talked quite a while. Got any questions? Yeah.
Can you tell me the connection to Fort Sarah and Fort Larned?
Okay, Fort Sarah was established in 1864 as an outpost of Fort Larned,
Mm-hmm.
and it remains an outpost of Fort Larned until they decide to rebuild it with stone in 1867. 1868 is finished, then it becomes a post of its own right and has post returns. Units from 64 through 68 were rotated between Larned and Fort Sarah. Everything was taken to Larned and then taken back to Fort Sarah for whatever they needed. But for that very last year of Fort Sarah's existence, it was a fort in its own right, not just an outpost of Larned.
Okay, that explains it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. That was an easy one. George? I got one back here first.
Buffalo soldiers, they were what, the 10th Cavalry?
Yeah, the Buffalo Soldiers were the 9th and 10th Cavalry. We only had the 10th Cavalry out of Larned.
How many soldiers in each?
There were supposed to be 100 men in the company, and the Buffalo Soldiers, when they arrived, did have 100 men in their company. They'd just been organized. But the infantry units, when we averaged that out, it came to 68 men. We took several of the muster rolls that we have all for the year of 1868, and we averaged all of them together, and it came out 68 as the average for an infantry company.
Did they come from the Civil War, the Buffalo Soldiers? I mean, their training and, or that come later?
Well, yes and no. A lot of people like to say that we're all Civil War veterans, but from Nicholas Nolan's accounts and some of the others I've read, they preferred recruiting in cities instead of trying to get freed black slaves from the South that came from the Civil War. But certainly some of them were. They preferred for some reason, blacks that were in cities like New York, Chicago, St. Louis. That's where they did most of the recruiting for the Buffalo Soldiers. Now, to say that every Buffalo Soldier is dark skinned is wrong. You might be mixed race, but your class is black. You might not be very dark skinned, but just enough to kind of tell you're still to be put in the Buffalo Soldier ranks. And apparently some of the mulattoes, anybody of a mixed race was just pretty much thrown into the Buffalo Soldier units. It is another thing, a lot of people like to speculate with discrimination on, say, horses and equipment. It's not true. The Buffalo Soldier units, they weren't called Buffalo Soldiers yet. You know, that name doesn't come really until about 1871. It's not really known for certain how they got the name. Most everybody says it's because of the bison and the curly hair and the name Honor and Distinction, which is probably true. But when the 10th Cavalry or the 7th Cavalry, 6th, 2nd, any of these guys, when they converted to cartridge guns, they were given Spencer carbines. The 10th Cavalry had Spencer carbines. They were given surplus Civil War sabers. They didn't make new ones, got some of the old ones. They had the surplus sabers. The revolvers the 10th Cavalry got were exactly the same as the 7th Cavalry got. The saddles were exactly the same. The horses were all the same. They were all brought into these depots at Fort Leavenworth and Riley and different places and issued out. They weren't discriminated against with pay or with uniforming and equipment. There's a lot of forms, like I said, of discrimination, but that is one. Yeah.
Where was the 10th sent after they left Larned?
They went south, down into Oklahoma, Fort Sill, Fort Davis areas. The Buffalo Soldiers were used a lot like, maybe you might say the Marine Corps. They were divided out, like the Marines are divided out into boats. They oftentimes were not kept together as a big regiment. We'd have a company like Larned, a company at Fort Dodge or Hayes, someplace else. It's not like we're going to have 3 or 4 companies of blacks all together until into the 1880s. Then you start getting that. Like at Fort Davis, they did a lot.
And the 7th was broke up that way too.
Yeah, a lot of the units were broken up that way. Yeah. But the Buffalo Soldiers did get a lot of the dirtier assignments. You know, going out, like Nicholas Nolan wrote, his men were constantly on patrol, constantly going out into the field, escorting and on patrol. Yeah.
Did the Buffalo Soldiers, did any of them end up with Nicodemus in that community?
Nicodemus wasn't around.
It wasn't around then?
No, it comes later. The Nicodemus is the only real connection to Buffalo Soldiers as I can figure it is. One of the individuals who settled in Nicodemus had been a Buffalo Soldier. They have that connection. But Nicodemus is a community that was established by bringing these blacks in from the south, like a colony, and not soldiers in any way.
So back to today, what kind of archives do you have at Fort Larned, and what could someone like me go through and see?
We wouldn't trust you. Forget it. No, we do have. We have all the post records on microfilm. We have, like Nicholas Nolan's records, were so valuable to us in our research. We had those put on a disc. There's these companies that will do it. And so like this guy, Jay Clark, is doing the Buffalo Soldier thing.
Yes, that will be
Wichita.
at
We gave him the disc of all of Nicholas Nolan's records, so they would have that for their research.
Okay. So there's not a book about him yet or anything?
Oh, there's a lot of books about Buffalo Soldiers.
I mean about
Not
Nicholas.
about just Nicholas Nolan, no.
Yeah. That would be interesting. So if I make an appointment, I could come out and look at the archives?
We do have a post library too, because there's really great books in it. We've learned the hard way, we don't check out books
Oh,
or
yeah.
check out microfilm. Just get it back or it's damaged or something else. People can come out and use it there at the fort, but we don't check it out for the most part.
I'll send it over. Do you have Fort Zara records there too then?
Yeah. The State Historical Society has too. They have a really nice collection of microfilm in the state of Kansas.
I know Ancestry has some records.
Right. Yeah, we have the microfilm in Fort Zara. It's kind of interesting. Nicholas, when Fort Larned and Fort Zara were built, a man by the name of Rockwell, Colonel Lamont Rockwell, actually built both places. And with Zara, the blueprints exist. With Larned, they've gotten lost. But Rockwell sent them all in at the same time. And how one survived and the other one hasn't, I don't know. But we even have the blueprints for Fort Zara.
Really?
Detail you want to know about it, it's on those blueprints.
Okay.
But the museum there in Zara's got that too, I'm sure it has. And interesting about Rockwell, he was at Washington, D.C. building monuments. He worked some on the Washington Monument that was being built at the time he was there. Then he just happened to be at Ford's Theater, watching like everybody else, bang, Lincoln gets shot. Being a colonel, he helps carry Lincoln across the street and stays with Lincoln until Lincoln passes away. Go forward in time. He had been a Civil War officer, of course. Knew Garfield. When the train arrives at the station in Washington and Garfield gets shot, he actually was right there and saw that one. He was a personal friend, not just of Garfield, but also of his wife. He accompanies Garfield to his house. And Mrs. Garfield asked him to stay with them and to help. Garfield would have survived. People had started sticking his fingers in him and everything else, and affecting him and all this stuff. But he was at 2 presidential assassinations, the man who built the stone buildings. He got so upset after that, he resigned his citizenship in the United States after Garfield moved to Paris. He lived the rest of his life in France. So I've had enough of this. That's it. George?
Yeah, I went through some of the post returns last week at Great Bend from Fort Zara. And what I noticed is, we found that stone over there at the Stone Corral, or it was from a basement nearby, with this soldier's initial his name in there, 13th Missouri Cavalry. Well, I found him in the hospital records there.
Good.
After that, 6 times, 6 different times in a little over a month. 5 of them were rheumatism, and 1 of them was scurvy. And looking at all the others in there, I was seeing, there was a lot of scurvies, and there was some syphilis.
Yeah.
And one thing I noticed, not just in post returns in general, there's kind of like, and with 7th and different ones, but there's kind of like always an officer on detached recruiting duty somewhere in a big city.
Each company's allowed 3 officers, and almost always one of them is on either detached recruiting duty or court-martial duty somewhere else. You'd have to have so many officers to hold a court-martial. Normally, you only have 2 officers present at the company. That's the Little Bighorn. Same thing happened with the 7th United States Cavalry, and there are a couple of books out. What if the entire Army Officer Corps had been present instead of the reduced officer corps that they had at the time? Would they have been able to, like one of them was Colonel Larned, not the colonel the fort's named after, but his brother, who became a West Point officer. He was a 7th Cavalry officer who was on recruiting detail and wasn't with the 7th at the time of the battle.
Lucky for him.
Lucky for him, but he was also a very tactical-minded individual. And if he had been here, there with him, would he have said, whoa, wait a minute, Colonel Custer, let's think about this, because he was also a colonel.
Now, you probably know about this incident out in Fort Larned involving Captain Parmenter,
Sure.
which I always thought was maybe somewhere somebody made that F-Troop show.
No, actually, no. Okay.
Okay.
Captain Palmer he's talking about, he was the officer that went down to the Arapaho village and they left down there. He He was an alcoholic, he was a drunkard. He tried to review the men out on the parade ground one time, fell off his horse, he was so intoxicated. Most of the officers were absolutely embarrassed by him. They were writing to the War Department, trying to get him out, and they eventually got him removed. But I had an interesting thing with this. When F Troop was on TV, we had a visitor come through, and I was visiting with him as well at Hollywood with F Troop. I said, we had an officer here by the name of Palmater. How did you select the name Palmater for F Troop? He said, we know about him. He said, actually, that's what that movie was based off of.
Wow.
Well, that's what I was thinking, because I'd read an account
Yeah.
in the Rocky Mountain News that somebody from Fort Larned had wrote to the editor there in Denver, and he talked about this drunken Captain Parmenter that was sent out there because he was some kind of Civil War reject. And
That's true.
and and then they talked about he let the Indians come in and raid off 100 and whatever, few hundred horses, and
Yeah, raided 172 horses and mules. Big embarrassment for the Army. The Kiowa came in, they put on a big dance, and they were hoping all the soldiers would go out and watch it. Well, Palmater didn't do anything to protect the animals, didn't issue any orders. He was so drunk that one of the scouts finally got word to the men to stay, protect yourselves, stay up in the barracks, don't get fooled, don't go down there and watch this dance, they'll kill you. And so nobody did, and they just literally took the animals and left. The only horses that were left were some that belonged to one of the artillery units that happened to be there. Huge embarrassment to the Army.
so I didn't know the Kiowas were there, so maybe that's
That was
where
the Kiowa that took them.
So maybe that's where the Cowies come from.
Kiowa did more damage there near the tribe. They burned a bridge in 1864. They stole the horses. There were a lot of Kiowa.
How did Fort Larned connect with Camp Pearson over here then, in Rice County? Did it?
No.
Not really? It was just an outpost
An
over here?
outpost, yeah, but not really a farm. No. We do have an account of Henry Booth who came through this area. They were in an Army ambulance, and they did get attacked by Indians, he and another officer. And he said, well, what I started doing was reaching down into my valise, and I would throw out an emblem, throw out this other little thing, and the Indians would all stop and pick it up. They'd shoot arrows, they got stuck in the wagon. He said, finally, I threw out my sword and my dress coat, and that's all they wanted. Left us alone. Yeah, some of the officers' accounts are really fun to read in their personnel records. One of the guys wrote between Fort Zara and Dodge, going back on the detail by himself, in a buffalo herd the entire distance. He said, I was never out of the buffalo herd all the way from Zara to Dodge. That's not.
It's hard to imagine.
I know. Well, before everybody else goes to sleep, I'll call them. Yes.
Did you have any, were there galvanized Yankees stationed in
Yes,
there?
we did have galvanized Yankees.
Would that have contributed to the with the problems with the Buffalo soldiers?
Oh, no, they were gone.
They were gone.
Then right at the end of the Civil War, the United States Army realized we've got all these Confederates in prison. Why don't we enlist them basically into the Union Army? They had to raise their hand. They had to swear that they would serve honorably. And the government side, we said they wouldn't have to fight against other Confederates. They'd just be brought out west, guard the mail lines, and keep things going. Just a way to get guys out of prison camps, and boy, it worked. I would have done it. Those prison camps were horrible. I don't care whether it's Andersonville or a Union camp. They're all of them horrible. They brought out, we had a company of galvanized Yankees there 64 through 66. And the Buffalo soldiers arrived in 66.
Wasn't the 13th Missouri Cavalry a galvanized Yankee unit?
No, that's a state unit, Missouri. Galvanized Yankees, you can always tell the difference. They were called U.S. Volunteers. Instead of U.S. regulars, it still has, like the 2nd U.S. Volunteers, when they say that, they're galvanized Yankees. They're volunteering, and they're U.S. troops. If it says Missouri or Kansas, there was Kansas or Missouri troops. Like the 19th
Okay.
U.S., or 19th Kansas. It doesn't have the U.S., it'll have the state designation. By the way, does anybody know Custer's official title? It's kind of funny. During the Civil War, he gets to be a general. But the Indian Wars, he never rises above the colonel. If you were going to address George Armstrong Custer, who walks in the door right now, it would be, Lieutenant Colonel, Brevet Major General George Armstrong Custer, sir. Lieutenant Colonel is his current rank. He has a brevet rank of a Major General, and so you had to give him that honor of having been a general. So Lieutenant Colonel, Brevet Major General.
I never remember all that.
It sounds like something.
You don't have to remember any of that.
I
I just think it's funny.
I'll bet most of them shortened it to just general.
They did, yeah. Kit Carson was already famous, and he was out in the fort in 1865, came in on the stagecoach. And he's a little stir. He was already famous, and the famous Kit Carson's arriving on the stage.
When are you gonna write a book about all this stuff? Because you know all these details about
It's all in
Fort Larned.
records.
I've now
It's all out there.
I've learned how to pronounce Fort Larned. I started Fort
You used to say
Larned.
Larned. Okay, how do you pronounce N-E-D?
Larned.
N-E-D, it's pronounced
Ned.
Ned.
Yes.
Okay, it's pronounced Ned, not nerd, you nerd.
Now, I can hear you say Washington.
Yeah, that's what Kansas, he's got Kansas too.
I
Yes.
know.
Arkansas River, or Arkansas River. I get corrected on all that all the time. I'll say Arkansas, people excuse me, it's Arkansas.
When you're here.
Actually,
I've
officially,
looked at Larned.
the name in the 1930s
Larned.
was, by the United States government, said to be pronounced Arkansas. But here in Kansas, we call it the Arkansas. or Arkansas.
Yeah, they passed a bill, and I forget what they had named in there, but when I was reading about back now, but they called it the Arkansas.
Yes.
Or maybe it's a treaty or something there.
Treaty of the Arkansas.
But then they changed it to Arkansas,
Right.
Arkansas, and because they spelled it saw.
Right.
Yeah. And that was the French way of doing it.
Well, thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Well, guys,